Hi, good evening and welcome to 3GNY Stories Live, We Do Wednesdays. I'm Farah Krause, grandchild of 2 Holocaust survivors and 3GNY board member. I'm thrilled to be here for our third We Do Wednesday featuring special guest speaker, Shelley Rood Wernick. 3GNY is an educational nonprofit organization for grandchildren of survivors and our supporters. As a living link, we preserve the legacies and the lessons of the Holocaust. Our mission is to educate diverse communities about the perils of intolerance and to provide a supportive forum for the descendants of survivors. Founded in 2005 with a group of 6, 3GNY's membership now exceeds 2,500. Before COVID-19, we held diverse in-person programs including museum tours, film screenings, theater engagements, discussion groups, book talks, volunteering with survivors, Shabbat dinners, Jewish cultural events, intergenerational gatherings, genealogy workshops, and more. We've recently pivoted to virtual events and are proud to share our work with those of you who ordinarily wouldn't be available to attend our programs, along with our valued community members. 3GNY has also played a leading role in launching other 3G groups, including 3G DC and 3G New Jersey. 3GNY is proud of our flagship educational program, We Do, short for We Educate. This initiative empowers the grandchildren of survivors to learn and compellingly share their family's Holocaust experience in school classrooms and with community groups. We Do is developed under the guidance of Facing History and Ourselves, and it prepares participants to learn and teach their family stories. We Do is a powerful contribution to Holocaust education. As the population of survivors declines, their stories should not be lost with them. Now is the time to take responsibility for these stories. Last summer, when we took travel and gathering for granted, I, along with 5 other 3GNY board members, David, Dylan, Lori, Leora, and Dan, were excited to bring We Do to Washington, D.C. We trained an amazing group of 10 speakers, including Courtney and Shelley, who you will hear from shortly. Tonight, I'm proud to showcase our collaboration with 3GDC, and I'm especially excited to hear Shelley share her grandfather's story. It was a pleasure to watch the journey Shelley took while developing her presentation. As a living link to our grandparents' stories, we are in a special position to elevate the individual experience from the collective. We create a personal connection to history. The Holocaust serves as an instructive entry point for examining prejudice today. Our speakers make connections between historical events and issues of intolerance and persecution that remain with us today. In a multicultural society, we all have a stake in challenging assumptions. We Do actively engages students to think about ways to confront intolerance and prejudice. Our ability to share authentic stories allows us to connect with people from different backgrounds and with different levels of understanding. This creates dialogue and inspires students to explore their own family history as an entry point to understanding world history. For We Do, we have a collaborative partnership with the American Society for Yad Vashem's Young Leadership Associates Group. We are very thankful for their support. Since We Do started in 2010, we've trained 250 speakers, visited over 250 classrooms in at least 84 different schools, and have reached more than 25,000 students. We are still going strong. Since COVID-19 hit, we've moved our We Do training sessions onto Zoom. We're now visiting classrooms via various virtual platforms and working with teachers to ensure we can still make an impact even if we cannot meet in person right now. We have so much more to do, and we're making it happen however we can. In order for us to keep doing this critical work, your support is essential. 3GNY is volunteer run and relies on donations to keep We Do and many other programs going. Any amount, big or small, will help us sustain We Do and train even more grandchildren of survivors. For example, $300 sponsors 1 grandchild to go through the We Do program. $3,600 will sponsor an entire We Do class of 12. Please check the chat box for links to make a donation. We hope you'll consider a gift. Thank you for helping us to honor the memories of our grandparents and ensuring that never forget is more than just an empty phrase. At this time, I'd like to introduce Courtney Tisch from 3GDC, who will share more about the important work being done by our friends in the nation's capital.
Thank you so much, Farah. My name is Courtney Tisch, and I'm the chair of 3GDC, as well as granddaughter of 2 Holocaust survivors. Similar to 3GNY, 3GDC's mission is to carry on the lessons and legacies of Holocaust survivors located in the DC, Maryland, and Virginia areas. We strive to build community for local 3Gs so that we can share the stories of our grandparents' survival and ensure that those memories are passed down and remembered by future generations. We provide educational programming, speaker training, community service, and social activities for grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, as well as our friends and supporters. Just as 3GNY has pivoted from in-person to online programming during this unprecedented time, so too has 3GDC. A true silver lining during the switch to online programming is that we've been able to partner with 3GNY on a variety of virtual events just like this one, without location being a barrier. I'm excited for more great work we can and will continue to do together. Now, it is my honor and pleasure to introduce Shelley Rood Wernick. Seriously, one of the most incredible women I've come to know. Coincidentally, we met for the first time during last summer's We Do class. Shelley professionally is the managing director of the Center for Advancing Holocaust Survivor Care at the Jewish Federations of North America. Shelley and her team bring resources to local organizations that help Holocaust survivors live more comfortably as they age. She works with the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services to bridge the gap between the fields of aging and trauma by recognizing that a history of trauma is a risk factor for poor mental, social, emotional, and physical health. Previously, Shelley lobbied on behalf of federations in the network of Jewish human service agencies, conveying policy priorities to Congress and the White House, and training communities to advocate for the diverse populations they serve. Shelley has earned a BA and an MBA and currently serves on the board of Hillel at the University of Florida. And with that very impressive introduction to Shelley, I now hand this program over to her. Thank you for representing 3GDC tonight and for sharing your grandfather's story.
Thank you, Courtney. Thank you, Farah. Thank you, 3GDC and 3G New York. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be with you and to be able to share my grandfather's story. My grandfather shared his story with me over the course of many evenings, many days, while I was growing up in South Florida. And all of the stories that I'm going to share with you are ones that he personally told me. I know he wanted these stories to be told. He was a Hebrew school educator his entire life. He spent his entire life dedicated to educating people before the Holocaust, during the Holocaust, and after the Holocaust. And it's really an honor to be able to carry on that legacy. When my grandfather begins his talk about his Holocaust experience, he tells about his family, and then he always starts with the German invasion of Poland. He grew up in Warsaw. He was born in 1918, grew up in Warsaw in a small apartment, and he lived with his mom and his dad and his sister and his brother. His parents were Orthodox Jews, and they lived in a very Jewish neighborhood. And in fact, growing up, he never interacted with non-Jewish people. His brother was 11 years older than he was, and he studied to become a teacher. And my grandfather followed in his footsteps and also studied education. His brother, Shlomo, who was 11 years older, moved to Jerusalem in the 1930s. And that becomes important later in this story. His sister was Rachel, and she was 2 years younger than he. They lived in a small apartment, and they had a general store down below. I'm going to show you some pictures of his family. That's my grandfather and me. They had a general store down below, and so they were able to bring food into their apartment, and they were doing well at the beginning of the war. There was a lot of anti-Semitism before the war, but like I said, my grandfather didn't really interact with non-Jewish people while he was growing up. This is my grandfather on the left, Hersch Berman. This is his father in the center, David Berman, and his sister on the right-hand side, Rachel Berman. And here we have, again, his sister, Rachel, his mother, Leah, and his older brother, Shlomo, who went to Jerusalem. Like I said, during the beginning, before the war, he didn't really interact with non-Jewish people until he went to the university, also before the war, where he ended up graduating with a degree in education. And at the university, he experienced a lot of anti-Semitism. Other students would regularly beat him up, break his glasses. His mother didn't even want him going to university anymore because he would come home beat up every day. He said the worst days to walk around the streets were Sundays, because the Polish churches would let out on Sundays, and the leadership of the churches would spew hatred against Jews, and it was basically a free-for-all to beat up on Jews on the streets on Sundays. That was life growing up. But then in 1939, everything changed very starkly. And Germany invaded Poland and came to Warsaw, and there were German soldiers on the street, and they were destroying everything. They were shooting and looting and destroying buildings. And my grandpa was in his apartment with his parents and his younger sister, and they were all wondering what's going on outside. They can hear a lot of commotion, a lot of screaming, and they were wondering, what should we do? Should we go down to the basement to hide? We don't want anyone to see, we don't want the Germans to see us if we're here. And all of a sudden their plans were interrupted, and they heard knocks at the door, pounds at the door, boom, boom, with rifles banging on their apartment door. They opened the door, and 5 German soldiers with rifles pointed their guns and spears at my grandpa and his father. And they said, "Give us all of your valuables, give us all of your gold." And my grandfather said, "I don't have any gold. I don't have any valuables. I'm not such a rich man to have money or gold." And his sister was crying, and his mother was crying. And the father said, "I don't have any money to give you." And the soldiers started ransacking the apartment and looking in all of the cabinets and looking everywhere for gold. They didn't find any, but they did see food, because, as I mentioned, my grandfather's family had a general store. So they had brought a lot of food up into their apartment. And they saw flour, and they wanted that. And they saw a large crate of eggs, and they said, "Eier" in German, eggs. And they made my grandpa and a neighbor carry this very large crate of eggs down to the trucks to use for food for the German soldiers. And it was a very large crate, hundreds of eggs actually in it. And my grandpa said to his neighbor, let's break the eggs. Let's shake them. Let them not eat our eggs." And the neighbor said, "Are you crazy? They'll shoot us if they see us doing this." And my grandpa said, "Well, we got to wait till they're not looking at us." So that's what they did. They waited, went behind a building and shook the eggs, broke every single one of them, carried the crate into the truck, and for good measure carried other items that the Germans were looting into their trucks. And then they heard a German officer blow a whistle, and just like that, all of the soldiers went into their trucks, sped away, and that was that. And after that, everything changed. Now they were living under Nazi occupation. Each member of each household was required to give one family member to work at the Citadel in Warsaw, to work on behalf of the German army. So my grandfather went every day to work at the Citadel, helping to move munitions around in the Citadel for the Germans. And they had to work very hard every day, starting at 5 o'clock in the morning. And there was a German soldier that would beat them if they didn't work hard enough. And there was a curfew every evening when they had to leave and go home for the night. And after this curfew imposed by the Germans, anyone who was on the street would be shot. No questions asked. You couldn't be on the streets anymore. Well, this became a big problem because now that they were essentially in a war zone, all of the utilities had been cut off for the apartments. There was no more water. There was no more electricity. And so the only way for my grandfather's family to get water was if he were to go to a well 5 miles away from the home and carry 2 pails of water. So after working at the Citadel, he went to the well, saw a line of about 100 people. He knew he had to get this water. It was approaching curfew. He got the water, and curfew came. And all of a sudden they were shooting everywhere. There was fire and just indiscriminate shooting at anyone who was moving on the street. He hid and knocked on some houses, "Let me in, they're shooting me, they're gonna get me." No one would open their door because they're shooting everywhere. And eventually he made it to his house and hid behind, somehow with the pails of water, got into his apartment, and his family could not believe that he was alive. They were all crying. They thought that he had surely been killed. After this very dangerous moment, he realized, he needed to escape. There was no hope for life under Nazi Germany. At the same time, the Germans required all of the people in the Citadel to not go home anymore. So he wasn't even allowed to go home at night anyway. And he and four other people who were essentially prisoners at the Citadel planned their escape. And in the middle of one night, they climbed up one of the walls. There was a hole in the wall for ammunition, and they took their shoes off so that they couldn't be heard, climbed up, looked through the hole, saw all of the German soldiers below were drunk and partying, and realized now would be a very good time to escape while they're distracted. So they went through the hole down below, and as soon as they got down, the Germans noticed that some people had escaped. So there were searchlights searching for them. Germans started shooting. He and his friends came to a river that was right outside of the Citadel, and a small raft, an old rotted boat, actually, it was abandoned. They knew that this boat was their only hope for escape, because on the other side of that river was Russian territory. At the time, Germany had attacked Poland from the west, and Russia had attacked Poland from the east. So Poland was divided, and they were able to cross this river to safely get into the Russian side. They had to do this very, very quietly and carefully with oars, not with oars, with their hands, using their hands as oars very quietly in order to get across to the other side. So you can see on these maps, Poland today has Warsaw right here along a river. And you can see they had to cross this river to get into the Russian side, where they could at least be safe from working in the Citadel. Now that they're on the Russian side, it's still middle of the night. They're in a forest. They are wondering, where do they go next? They saw some lights. They thought maybe, we could go to this house, but it turns out they were animal eyes in the middle of the night. And eventually they were able to knock on some farmers' doors saying, let me in, let me in. Nobody would let them in because they didn't want to be hiding refugees. Now these Polish people are under Russian, Soviet control. Eventually they were able to bribe a farmer with a watch that my grandfather had taken from his home. And the farmer let them stay, said, you can stay here tonight. I don't want to know who you are, don't tell me, but you have to be gone in the morning. So the farmer gave them some soup, let them stay in a barn at night, and in the morning they had to leave. But how were they going to get out? There were Soviet soldiers everywhere. So the farmer came up with a plan. He said, every day I take this wagon full of potatoes into the market to sell them. Get in this wagon, I'm going to cover you with potatoes, and that's how I'll sneak you out of my land. And after that, he didn't care what happened to them. So they covered them with potatoes. My grandpa said that they were so terrified they couldn't even tremble because the potatoes would then tremble. But the plan worked, and they made it into the town. And that's where they were able to, my grandfather was able to mix in with the population there. He of course spoke Polish. He was among Polish people and now Soviet soldiers, not German soldiers. He went to Bialystok and got a job teaching and was asked to register with the Soviet authorities. And the Soviet authorities, as soon as they asked him to register as a Soviet citizen, my grandpa said, no, I don't want to become a Russian citizen because then I would have to give up my Polish citizenship. And he wanted to eventually return to Poland to be with his family after the war. So he said he was not going to become a Soviet citizen. And immediately, no questions asked, they said, okay, you're sentenced to 3 years in a concentration camp because you're an enemy of the state. You're a traitor. And you need to sign this form and you're going right away to the concentration camp. And to do hard labor. And my grandpa said, I'm not going to sign that form. That's ridiculous. And the Soviet soldier said, okay, I'll sign it for you. Then he signed it. And next thing you know, my grandfather was arrested, deported on a cattle car, the kind of cattle car trains that you hear about in the history books, 100 people to a car, a hole in the middle for the bathroom, no light, the windows were all wired shut, for 30 days, sent to work hard labor in Siberia. Actually, north of Siberia, as my grandfather described it, it was colder than Siberia. And in this concentration camp, his job was to cut down trees. And the entire group of a few thousand people would actually move from forest to forest, cutting down trees in the tundra, 50 degrees below, with bits of rubber tires that they used to make his shoes, and a small, like a thin cotton coat. He had, frostbite. His feet were black. He could no longer see his feet. There was barely any food. They were given a tiny bit of soup and coffee each morning at 5 in the morning to last for the entire day, and death was all around. This was not the kind of concentration camp where they were shooting people or gassing people, but they were working them to death and giving them no food. And so people were dying every day of starvation, of scurvy. They had no vitamins. They got typhoid. My grandfather got very sick. He did not know how he survived this concentration camp. And I'm actually going to read a quote that he said to me. He says, "I don't know how I'm alive. I don't know, because it's impossible to go through this being alive. I can assure you nobody's alive from that time, not even one person except me." This was the most difficult period of the Holocaust for him, being in that camp, because like he said, it was nearly impossible to survive. After 2 years of hard labor in Siberia, the Soviets were losing badly to the Germans, and they needed to replenish their military because they suffered so many casualties. And so they thought, all right, let's take all of these political prisoners and Jews and other people that we had brought to Siberia, and let's have them be an army to fight the Germans. So they formed this Polish unit, and my grandfather volunteered. He said, okay, I'll join this Polish unit of the army to fight the Germans, because that will be my ticket out of the concentration camp. So he and others who had agreed to join the Polish army were put on another train and brought south to Uzbekistan. He was very glad to be going south, because at least it would be warmer there. And when he got to Uzbekistan, he had to work in various farms as they were trying to organize this army. He would steal food from different farms. He would see melons growing in the fields, and he and others would look and try to steal food to survive, because they didn't provide nearly enough to survive. While he was there in Uzbekistan, the Soviets said, actually, we don't want any Jews in this army, in this Polish army. Let's kick out all of the Jews. So they kicked my grandfather out of the army before he had a chance to actually do anything in the army. And now here he was in Uzbekistan, living among the Uzbek people. They were living in tents. He was sleeping on floors or in fields. And he developed a very bad infection in his leg and couldn't move anymore, couldn't travel, couldn't walk, and ended up going to a hospital, a Soviet-run hospital in Uzbekistan, to recover. And while he was there in the hospital, he said that there was lice. You would see clothing moving around because of the lice, and people were dying. They had no supplies. This was the Soviet Union losing badly in the war. And he said, if someone died, you would reach over to their bed and take the bread that they had hidden under their pillow to survive. He recovered in this hospital, and outside, nearby the hospital, he saw that there was an orphanage. And he thought, all right, I can teach children. Maybe I can get a job here working in this orphanage. Maybe they'll give me food. So he went to the orphanage, asked them to give him a job. He said, I'm a teacher. I have a degree. I can speak all of these languages. I can teach here. And the orphanage, they looked at him and said, you're not a teacher. You're a bum. Look at you. You're half dead. You have all of these diseases. You have no clothes. You're a mess. He was just 2 years in the concentration camp. And my grandfather said, I know I don't look good, but I assure you I'm a very good teacher. And they said, okay, we're going to ask you some questions about Polish literature. And if you can answer these questions, you get the job. So they asked him questions, he answered the questions, and he got the job working in the orphanage as a teacher. He also ended up working as a teacher at a school for Uzbeks, for Muslim Uzbek children. And in the evenings, for extra bread, he worked as a person who was guarding sheep in an orchard. He guarded 21 sheep every night. They gave him a rifle without bullets to make sure that no one stole these sheep and that the sheep wouldn't go anywhere. And the sheep became evening companions for him, and it actually gave him some light moments in his life at that time. And he would get bread for this, and with the bread, he would exchange in the market for butter or for soap. Soap was very valuable. And with the soap, he could exchange that for other items or even clean himself with. So he ended up staying in Uzbekistan for a good number of years, for 3 years, until after the war, until 1946. So the war had ended. He learned that the war had ended. He was able to become stronger, healthier, using the extra bread that he earned, make himself look more decent. And after the war had ended, he went back to Poland. Poland was repatriating its refugees. And he went back to Poland in order to work with Jewish Zionists to help organize and bring people to Israel. His brother was still in Israel the entire time. And his family in Warsaw and my grandfather himself were writing letters for as long as they could to his brother in Jerusalem. And his brother was able to save all of those letters and photographs. And that's how we have so much of this history. So grandfather goes back to Poland, finds complete destruction, just bricks. I mean, really, there's nothing left. He learned that his parents and his sister had been killed. Someone that knew his parents saw them the day before the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. So he believes that they fought in the uprising and were killed then. But he knew that there was nothing left there. So he was organizing students, organizing children to go to Palestine, to go to Israel, to build the state, and also worked in locating Jewish children who had been hidden in villages and in farmlands during the war. Many of the Jewish parents had bribed farmers to hide their Jewish children so that they could survive the war living as Polish Catholics. And these children lived as members of other people's families. And my grandfather, because he was a teacher, because he was used to working with children, was tasked with going to locate these children and bring them to Israel. He faced extreme anti-Semitism back in Poland and realized that this was not where he wanted to be. He wanted to go to Israel as well. The Polish police were shooting at him when he would go to the farmers' houses or go to orphanages to come and get children. They thought he was kidnapping. There were pogroms. The anti-Semitism from the Polish people was worse than before the war. They didn't want the Jews coming back to their old homes. So he knew this was a bad place to be. So he decided he was going to go to Israel. The way to get there was through Czechoslovakia and then through Austria. While in Austria, he got a job as a teacher at a displaced persons camp. The DP camps were places where the Allied forces would organize refugees and Jewish people who had no other place to go after the war. So he was a teacher in a displaced persons camp, again, always a teacher. And he was a very good teacher, and they asked him, okay, now can you move to this other camp and be a teacher at this other larger camp? And he said, I'm so tired of moving around, I'm done. And they said, well, we'll give you a new suit. And he really wanted to have a new suit for when he would go to Israel. He would have at least one decent thing to wear. And so he went, and when he went to check out this new displaced persons camp, he saw my grandmother there and met my grandmother. She was acting in a play there at the camp, and he ended up saying, okay, I'll move to this larger camp. He became my grandmother's teacher, and she is my grandmother. They fell in love, and that part is history. They actually got married there in the displaced persons camp, and my grandmother gave me her engagement ring, which I wear. I think it's very special. It's a ring that my grandfather had made for her there at the camp. They lived there for a good while. My grandmother's parents and brother had also survived the Holocaust, and they were looking to move to Miami because some relatives of her family lived in Miami. They made the quota to move to Miami, but my grandmother and grandfather did not make the quota. And so instead they had to first go to Toronto. And in Toronto, they were able to reestablish a life there. My grandfather got a job as a teacher, of course, and they lived in Toronto for 4 years until 1955, when they were able to move down to South Florida, to Miami, to rejoin the rest of the family. And that is where my mother was born, down in Miami, and that's how my family got to Florida. I have a few other pictures that I'd like to share with you. Here you can see a map of the travels that my grandfather took, starting out in Warsaw, being shipped on a cattle car train to north of Siberia. I added that in there. I don't actually know where he was north of Siberia, but it was north of Siberia. And then down south to Uzbekistan, back to Poland, and to Austria. And then from there to Canada and to the United States. The top left photograph is a picture of one of the DP camps in Austria. You can see my grandfather here at the top left, that's Hersch, along with other teachers and students in the camp. These are the students. And the bottom right is a photo of my grandmother, Ray, isn't she beautiful? And my grandfather, Hersch. This is their wedding photo. They got married there in the camp. Here are some photos from early life in Miami. You can see my grandmother, Ray, my grandfather, Hersch. This is my mom, Leah. She was named after my grandfather's mother, Leah, who was killed. And her middle name is Rochelle, named after his sister, Rachel. And this is my uncle David, named after my grandfather's father, David. And the photo on the right is of their Hebrew school. My grandpa was a Hebrew school educator for 40 years in Miami. He's here in the center. These are his students. And actually my mom is here in the photo, and my uncle as well. Always with students, always with children. My grandmother was also a Hebrew school educator. And here are some more modern photos of my grandfather and me. This is in 2002. And this is my grandmother. My grandmother is living in South Florida, still in Broward County, not Miami anymore. She's in Broward now. And my grandfather died in 2008. And I really love this picture on the right-hand side because he was purposely being silly for the camera. He always wanted to share his stories and always, took his life's work very, very seriously, but loved to be playful, especially with his grandchildren. He actually called us he has 5 grandchildren, and he said he had 1 granddaughter and 4 nuts. So he liked to be playful as well. So I wanted to include that photo in there as well. That is the presentation, and I'm really honored that so many people wanted to hear this story. I understand that many of his former students have joined on to listen, which is just an incredible show of respect for what he was able to teach people throughout his life. And I'm excited to take any questions that you have.
Wow, thank you, Shelley. Thanks for gifting us with your family story. We're now going to open it up for questions. If you have any questions for Shelley, please type it into the chat and we'll do our best to get to it. We are going to prioritize questions directed at Shelley and her story. So if you have any questions about the organizations or we do specifically, we will try to get to those as well. But if we can't, please email the email addresses in the chat box and we'll definitely get back to you. Thanks. Shelley, you work to support Holocaust survivors. How does your grandfather's story relate to your work?
Thank you. I do work to support Holocaust survivors. I work for the Jewish Federations of North America, and we help local organizations provide home services for Holocaust survivors, services to help them live more comfortably in their homes. I've always thought that my grandfather's story was special, and I've always appreciated what survivors of the Holocaust went through and how they wanted to teach us. So I've always had an interest in that. Professionally, this came about because we learned through our work in helping all vulnerable populations, all older adults, that Holocaust survivors had great needs. And so I was intrigued by this. I wanted to get involved and see if I could help in any way that I could to make sure that Holocaust survivors could live better as they age. They're our teachers and our heroes, and we need to make sure that we can do everything we can to support them and to enable them to continue educating us and speaking in schools as they continue to do even to this day.
This is just a comment. Ruth Gordon said, growing up, she knew him many years in Miami, and as a native, she always admired your grandfather's loving wife and family, that he was a special man with a deep love for Judaism and history. So thank you for that, Ruth. And then, what about your grandmother? What was her story like before they met?
My grandmother had a different story. She was born in Poland. Today it's actually Ukraine. The territories have changed. But she and her family fled deeper into the Soviet Union before the Nazis could occupy her town. So she and her father and mother and brother fled deep into the Soviet Union and then also into Uzbekistan. There were lots of Jewish refugees who went there. And that is how they were able to survive the war. And then after the war ended, they went to a DP camp in Austria, and that's where she met my grandfather. So it is a very different story. She wasn't under Nazi occupation, but still has a very unique and wild story as well.
Thank you. Was your grandfather always comfortable talking with you and others about his Holocaust experience?
My grandfather, yes, he was a sharer. He wanted everyone to hear this story, and that's one reason why I'm so happy to be able to share with you. He was so honored that the USC Shoah Foundation, Steven Spielberg's foundation, filmed him. He talked about what a great experience that was, that he was able to get his story filmed. He told me every story I've told you, he told me personally. Growing up, he would just talk about it. It wasn't something that he didn't talk about. And I know a lot of survivors have a hard time speaking about their stories, but my grandpa wanted to make sure that his family was remembered and that others who suffered were remembered as well, and to know that what he went through, he knew that it was unfathomable, a different world, a different life. You know, no one can understand that unless you've been there. He knew it was unfathomable to all of his family, to everyone, to me. But he wanted to share at least a little bit about it. And he did tell me that there were a lot of things that he could not share with me, things that were too horrible for me to know. And most of the stories he shared with me, I would say probably from age 5 to 20. I mean, really, 20, 25. My entire life, he was telling me these stories. And he was a great storyteller. The story about the Germans coming to his apartment is, those are his words. It comes alive because I used the words that he used.
Thank you. Did you have the letters translated and digitalized?
So the letters were donated to the Holocaust Museum, the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. I don't know what they have done with them. I don't know.
At what age did your grandparents start telling you of their past life in Poland and the horrors inflicted on them during the Nazi era and war?
I mean, like I said, for my grandfather, I don't remember a time when he didn't tell me these stories. It was from a young age. My grandmother, almost never, actually. It wasn't until college when I did a school project for my university studies where we were interviewing our grandparents about their experience as a minority. And I thought, it was a sociology class about minorities. And I thought, okay, my grandparents have a story about being a minority. So I interviewed both my grandfather and grandmother. And that was when I heard my grandmother's story for the first time. Her mother wrote a book, and I've read that book. So I know the story from that book as well. But my grandmother always deferred to my grandfather for him to tell his story because he was under Nazi occupation and she wanted his story told.
I have another message from your mother's cousin, Sharon. She says that your grandfather was also her mother's Hebrew school teacher in the DP camp and her Hebrew school teacher at her children's Hebrew school teacher. And he told all three of them the same great stories and jokes in class, and that all of Miami remembers him as a great and fun teacher.
Aww. Thank you, Sharon.
Did your grandfather ever return to Poland after starting his new life in the US?
He did as an educator for the March of the Living. He went back one time. He and my grandmother went. I think it was when I was in high school, actually. I was about 16, and I think 17 is the age when students go on the march. And he went with my grandmother as the survivors with a group from Miami, and he taught them his story there.
Here's a question for today. What do you think your grandfather would say about anti-Semitism or racism today?
one of the more distressing things I heard my grandfather talk about is that when he came to the US, Canada and the US really, he was very surprised and disappointed that he saw hatred here. He thought, you know, this is the United States is the land of the free. This is a democracy. They shouldn't have hatred there. And he saw that minorities, in particular African Americans, were treated badly, and there was segregation. And he couldn't believe what he saw. And he would sit at the back of the bus as a protest when he saw the segregation that was going on. It really bothered him. And he knew that life eventually did get better for minorities, but it bothered him always. And he even faced some, I don't know what the right word is, he faced some bad feelings from other Jews in the United States who he felt would look down at him as a refugee. They would hear his accent and realize that he's a refugee, and he didn't feel, you know, fully accepted. After a while, he didn't care anymore. He said, you know, he had his life and he was very satisfied with the career that he had built. But he did face that. And I should mention that both he and my grandmother were, as I said, educators their entire lives. And they were incredibly smart and talented people. My grandfather always beat us in Trivial Pursuit in every category. I mean, knew history and geography, spoke 7 languages. My grandmother still speaks 7 languages. They're just incredibly talented, wonderful people.
Great. Did your grandparents provide all the information, or did you do additional research on your own to put the story together in order to share it?
So for this highlights version, most of the stories were ones that my grandpa had told me personally. I also watched my grandfather's USC Shoah video that he made for Steven Spielberg, which had some additional details in it as well. But that's pretty much all the research that I have done. I looked up a few things after taking the 3G course, the We Do course. I was encouraged to look up names of certain places that my grandfather had mentioned. So for the very first time, I looked up on the internet, what was the Citadel in Warsaw, for example. He had talked about the Citadel, but I never knew what it was. And so I was able to, only this past year, look up what is the Citadel and learn the history of that.
And one final question. How did you have pictures from before the war?
Oh, great question. And actually, this leads into something else I was going to say. So as I mentioned, my grandfather donated materials to the Holocaust Museum and had more materials to donate even after he died. And after he died, my grandmother came up to Washington, D.C. with my mom, and we took a trip to the Holocaust Museum, and they were able to access archives that both he had donated as well as receive other materials. And we were able to look up certain places that my grandfather had talked about and look at photos from that other people had donated that mentioned places or situations that my grandfather was in. For example, there was in one of the DP camps, there was a bulletin board in one of the central offices, which my grandmother had never actually seen. And we're looking at a photo of this bulletin board here in the museum in Washington. And it said education. It was an organizational chart of the camp. And it said who had what positions in the camp. And my grandfather's Hebrew name, Zvi, was listed under where it said education in the central office of this camp, because he was part of the org chart of the camp. And my grandmother had never seen that picture before. She had never seen that organizational chart before. But when she saw that, it was, I think, very validating to say, yes, he was the education director in the camp, and there's the org chart that somebody else, gave a photo of. So there are other places to kind of, that we were able to pull information from. The photos that I have of his family from before the war had survived because they were with his brother Shlomo in Israel, and he saved everything. So he had photos from before the war that he had taken, and the family had sent letters to Shlomo throughout the war. And so anything that survived in an apartment in Jerusalem, and that's how we were able to donate it to the museum.
Wow, thank you. Shelley and Courtney, thank you for joining us for this event, and thanks for both being partners and friends to 3GNY. Shelley, we appreciate you sharing your grandfather's powerful story. And thanks again to all the viewers, wherever you're located, for joining us tonight. We're glad you took the time to hear Shelley's important family story. If you haven't yet made a gift to support our educational programs, we hope you'll consider making one now. Please refer to the chat box for links to make a donation. Thank you. Also, if you have any connections with teachers and educators who may want our speakers to present in their classes, please be in touch with us. We are always looking for more classes and opportunities for our speakers so we could continue our very important work. We hope to see you again soon. We have some great virtual events coming up, including We Do Wednesdays every 2 weeks. The next one is on August 19th and will feature Eric Fuhr, who will share his family story. Eric is the grandson of a Holocaust survivor, and he grew up listening to the stories of how his grandmother and great-grandmother fled Paris in 1942. When the pair was arrested in southern France, Eric's grandmother ultimately escaped a concentration camp through the kindness of a stranger. Eric became a We Do speaker in 2019 to share his family story and to highlight the importance of having empathy for a stranger in need. On Wednesday, September 2nd, we'll have a We Do Wednesday with Alexis Fishman, and on September 16th, Elise Wallach from 3G New Jersey will be our featured We Do Wednesday speaker. Tomorrow, on August 6th, please join us for a discussion of Korzak, a Polish film from 1990. We'll be sending an email with the details of upcoming events and a link to view tonight's program. Thanks so much for taking the time out of your evening to be with us. Have a great night. Thank you.